Long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific was already under strain. For nearly a decade, Imperial Japan had been at war in Asia, first in Manchuria, then across China, driven by a relentless need for raw materials. Oil, rubber, steel, and food were the lifeblood of a modern empire, and Japan possessed too little of its own. Expansion was not a choice, it was policy. The United States stood directly in the way. American influence in the Pacific, reinforced by naval bases and alliances, threatened Japan's ambitions. When Washington imposed economic sanctions and, ultimately, an oil embargo, Japanese leaders viewed it as an existential threat. Without fuel, the empire's war machine would grind to a halt within months. In Tokyo, the conclusion was stark: either retreat from Asia or strike first. In 1940, the United States relocated its Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. What was meant as a deterrent appeared, from Japan's perspective, as a blade held at the empire's throat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, understood that war with America would be long and brutal. His answer was a gamble one: decisive blow that might cripple U.S. power, long enough for Japan to secure its conquests. At dawn on the 7th of December 1941, that gamble was set in motion. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers launched hundreds of aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters descended on the sleeping base with devastating precision. Battleships lay moored in neat rows along Ford Island, perfect targets in the still morning air. Within hours, much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was burning or sinking. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Yet even in apparent triumph, the seeds of failure were already present. America's aircraft carriers, the true future of naval warfare, were not in harbor. What Japan destroyed were symbols of an older age. Battleships that had once ruled the seas but were now vulnerable to air power. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not end American resistance. It transformed it. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Nazi Germany declared war on America, and the conflict became truly global. As the United States reeled, Japan surged forward. Wake Island fell. Hong Kong and Singapore collapsed with shocking speed. The Philippines were overrun, forcing General Douglas MacArthur to flee and issue his grim promise: "I shall return." By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched across the Western Pacific, seemingly unstoppable. But the opening phase of the Pacific War was built on time Japan desperately needed, and America was already preparing to take back. In the spring of 1942, the Pacific War entered a new and terrifying phase. The United States was wounded but not broken, and President Roosevelt understood that America needed to strike back, if not to win territory, then to restore confidence. The answer was bold, unconventional, and symbolic. Tokyo itself would be hit. On the 18th of April 1942, 16 U.S. Army B-25 bombers lifted off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet. They were never meant to fly from a carrier, nor to return to one. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, the crews knew they would likely crash or be captured after the mission. The raid caused limited physical damage, but its psychological impact was immense. Japan was no longer invulnerable. The Pacific War had reached the Japanese homeland. Only weeks later, the war at sea revealed its new character. In the Battle of the Koro Sea, American and Japanese fleets fought without ever seeing one another. Aircraft alone delivered destruction across hundreds of miles of ocean. When the battle ended, the Japanese advance toward Australia had been halted. It was the first time Japan had been stopped. The decisive moment came in June 1942 at Midway. Thanks to American codebreakers, U.S. commanders knew where and when the Japanese fleet would strike. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto hoped to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. Instead, his own carriers sailed into an ambush. In a matter of hours, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Japan lost not only ships, but irreplaceable pilots and institutional knowledge. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted forever. Victory, however, did not bring peace. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Their objective was an unfinished Japanese airfield that threatened American supply lines. The fighting that followed was savage and intimate: jungle ambushes, night naval battles, and desperate charges in the dark. At sea, the Navy suffered humiliating losses, including the disaster at Savo Island. On land, Marines fought malnutrition, disease, and an enemy that refused to yield. Month by month, the Americans learned how to fight this war. Air superiority, carrier coordination, and logistics became weapons as powerful as rifles and artillery. By November 1942, Guadalcanal was finally secured. The Pacific War had reached its midpoint.
Japan had awakened a giant, and now that giant was learning how to fight back. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Pacific War was no longer defined by rapid conquest or dramatic reversals. It became a war of attrition, where victory was measured not only in territory gained, but in how much suffering each side could endure.
For Japan, every retreat demanded sacrifice. For the United States, every advance revealed the true cost of fighting an enemy that refused to surrender. One of the most decisive blows to Japanese morale and leadership came far from the front lines. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a radio message revealing the exact flight plan of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor was traveling to inspect Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands. U.S. commanders authorized a daring interception mission. Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters rose from Guadalcanal and ambushed Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. His death removed one of Japan's most capable strategists and symbolized the growing reach of American intelligence and air power. As the United States advanced, it encountered a grim pattern repeated across the Pacific. On the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, American troops fought not only the enemy but brutal weather, poor equipment, and isolation. More soldiers died from exposure and accidents than from combat. When defeat became inevitable, hundreds of Japanese soldiers chose mass suicide rather than capture, adhering to the Bushido Code. This refusal to surrender would shape every battle yet to come. In November 1943, the United States launched Operation Galvanic, targeting the Gilbert Islands. The first objective was Tarawa, a tiny coral atoll fortified into a deadly stronghold. American planners underestimated both the defenses and the environment. Low tide left landing craft stranded on coral reefs, forcing Marines to wade toward the beach under heavy fire. Machine gun nests, concealed bunkers, and coastal artillery tore into the first waves. Within hours, the beach was littered with bodies. After 4 days of brutal combat, Tarawa fell. Nearly all of the Japanese defenders were dead. More than 1,000 U.S. Marines lay killed beside them. For the American public, the battle shattered any remaining illusions of a quick or clean war. Footage filmed during the assault, later shown by order of President Roosevelt, revealed the raw violence of amphibious warfare and demanded a national reckoning with what lay ahead. These battles were not anomalies. They were warnings. Every island taken would be paid for in blood, and the closer the United States moved toward Japan, the higher the price would rise. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a test of systems, rather than a contest of will alone. From the American perspective, victory no longer depended on single heroic actions, but on coordination between intelligence, industry, air power, and naval doctrine. The United States had transformed itself into a war machine operating at a scale Japan could not match. One of America's greatest advantages was invisible. Codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, stripping Tokyo of surprise and forcing its commanders into reactive decisions. Battles like Midway and the interception of Admiral Yamamoto were not accidents of fate, they were products of intelligence supremacy. In modern warfare, information had become as lethal as bombs. Industrial power completed the equation. In shipyards across the United States, a new generation of Essex-class aircraft carriers slid into the water, faster, larger, and capable of carrying up to 100 aircraft. These floating airfields redefined naval dominance. Units moved steadily through the Panama Canal into the Pacific, forming carrier strike groups that could project power across entire regions. Japan, by contrast, struggled to replace lost ships and more critically trained pilots. Globally, the Pacific conflict reshaped Allied strategy. While the United States pushed westward across the ocean, Britain and the Soviet Union carried the main burden of fighting Nazi Germany. This Germany-first policy limited American resources in the Pacific, forcing commanders to choose targets carefully. Island hopping was not merely tactical efficiency. It was strategic necessity. As the war intensified, its moral dimensions grew impossible to ignore. Kamikaze attacks at Leyte and Okinawa shocked the world. To American observers, They represented fanaticism and desperation. To Japanese leaders, they were acts of ultimate loyalty. Civilians suffered on a catastrophic scale on Saipan, Okinawa, and later in Japanese cities subjected to strategic bombing. Total war erased the boundary between frontlines and home fronts. Across the globe, governments watched closely. The Pacific War demonstrated that future conflicts would be decided by air superiority, industrial output, and intelligence dominance. It was no longer enough to fight bravely. Nations had to fight intelligently or face annihilation. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had reached the gates of Japan itself. Island by island, the United States had pushed forward through a landscape of shattered coral, burned jungles, and silent graves. Victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa revealed a terrifying truth. If the invasion of the Japanese home islands came, the bloodshed would be unlike anything the war had yet produced. In April 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt died before seeing the end of the conflict he had led for more than a decade. His successor, Harry S. Truman, inherited a war already won in Europe but still raging in Asia. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman issued an ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Tokyo refused. The Japanese military, though broken, was unwilling to concede defeat. What followed changed history forever. On the 6th of August 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, a city ceased to exist. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction defied comprehension. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would suffer for years from wounds and radiation sickness. Almost simultaneously, Soviet forces swept into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing the last illusions of strategic survival. Faced with annihilation, Japan surrendered. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's unconditional capitulation. The Pacific War was over. The Second World War had ended, yet victory came at an immeasurable cost. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead soldiers and civilians alike. The Pacific War proved that modern conflict was no longer limited by geography or restraint. Air power, industrial might, intelligence dominance, and total mobilization had reshaped warfare beyond recognition. Today, the beaches of Tarawa, the caves of Iwo Jima, and the ruins of Hiroshima remain silent witnesses. They ask a question that history never answers easily. Were the lessons learned worth the price paid? If this story made you reflect on how wars are fought and how they end, share your thoughts below. What do you believe was the true turning point of the Pacific War? And if you value careful, respectful analysis of military history, consider subscribing as we continue exploring the battles that shaped our world.